Do you like dealing 20 billion damage? Of course you do. Everyone likes growing their power level in games to the most ridiculous extremes. Well, my friend, you're not alone. As a longtime enjoyer of the RPG genre, I think I speak for all of us when I say that big numbers make our brains feel good in ways that we can't accurately describe. The very essence of the RPG is bound to the concept of numbers and the process of their embiggening throughout the entire gameplay experience. There's many ways to do this, and doing it right is a form of art. It takes talent and creativity to use a number for a purpose that's not exclusively tied to progression or dopamine release. Sometimes there's a story, a relationship, or a shift in scale expressed through the difference between 10 and 10,000. Yet in the history of gaming, there may just be a handful of titles that have utilized simple digits in such a creative way. So since you're already here and the sunk cost fallacy is in full motion, why don't we take a look at some games that arguably did it right? Let's take a gander, let's see what the history of RPGs can tell us about numbers and how they can be used to great emotional effect. And if you feel like returning after we've concluded our journey, maybe subscribe? No? Okay, moving on. Back to the past, more than 40 whole years to the birth of a rather insignificant little game called Dungeons and Dragons. Yes, there was a smattering of other tabletop board games with similar number-based mechanics before that, but I think there's little debate as to who first successfully commercialized the idea. Dungeons and Dragons introduced its players to such fundamental concepts as character stats, ability scores, and hit points, of which still form the backbone of today's RPG experience. With a notable difference that playing D&D and keeping track of all the stats is a predominantly manual affair to this day. Keeping track of all you need to keep track of on sheets of paper or even digital note-taking tools can get a bit tedious, especially as the number of enemies and actions in a combat encounter increase. Not to mention that to determine if and to what degree an action succeeds, you have to roll one or multiple dice and consciously read the results of each one every single time. That's a positively mindful way to experience an RPG, and that may be part of why the tabletop genre has only grown in popularity in recent years. But you may have experienced some tedium yourself if you ever played an elongated campaign of Dungeons and Dragons where you found yourself in an encounter with 20-something participants, in which case you will know that one of those can take you multiple sessions to finish because you have to go through every enemy, determine their action, roll for success. It's a lot of work. So naturally the question arose if there wasn't any way to make this easier. If maybe there's something we can use that can make a lot of calculations very fast. And little Sheldon from 4th grade math class doesn't count, that's just a single boy. We need a large number of calculations at scale. Eventually we figured out that computers are really good at that exact thing. Since all the D&D fans were big nerds anyway, it didn't take them long to make use of the scarce computational resources of the time and very tediously create games inspired by the tabletop system. Many games were born out of that idea, many of which have faded into obscurity, though not all of the early RPGs of the time have vanished without a trace. The tabletop fever had unexpectedly spread all over the globe like a virus of some denomination. I'm sorry, YouTube doesn't like it when I talk about viruses. Such that it made its way all the way to the Far East, to the small island nation of good old Le Nihon, where it had been decided recently that working a 6 to 8 was slightly better than stabbing each other with samurai swords. Since people weren't overly busy waging wars and bombing each other anymore, there was yet untapped capacity for game development. So it was that the concept of RPGs was taken to another level entirely, with the birth of what is arguably the grandfather to all RPGs in 1987. Final Fantasy was the first game in the series that now spans decades and is still going strong, with 60 mainline entries and enough spin-offs to make Kingdom Hearts jealous. Isn't that the same publisher? What is it with the unnecessary spin-offs? Square Enix, stop this behavior. A game with a simple story of 4 heroes whose coming was foretold in a prophecy. The legendary warriors of light that would liberate the land of the evil that plagues it. The first entry to this illustrious series still still proudly wore its fundamental inspiration on its sleeves. Many of the game's enemies, like the goblins, the grey ooze, and of course the good old mind flayer, were distinctly reminiscent of old Dungeons & Dragons monster designs. But of course the game also modeled a digital tabletop system with hit points, attack statistics, accuracy, and even spell slots. Until recently, I had completely forgotten that mages in Final Fantasy I didn't have MP back then, imagine that. But why stop there? Why restrict yourself to the scales your predecessors have established? We are in the digital era now, which means no matter what size the number we throw at a problem, the computer will take care of all associated busywork for us. And, as is well known, the Japanese have a tendency to make things decidedly large in the charge, as is evidenced by all those mecha anime they made in the late 90s. So, of course, we're gonna have to pump up those numbers a bit, because those are rookie numbers. We need to go further beyond what our venerable ancestors accomplished. Large calculations would be unwieldy for a single human to deal with live, and therefore, even in modern D&D, you'll rarely see damage numbers exceed the 50 mark. And Final Fantasy starts with a similar sense of modesty, but as you keep playing, you'll notice that your strength keeps growing beyond what you could have expected as a player of the time. You're still playing the game, you're maybe 2 of the 3 main antagonists deep, and you're already somewhere around the level 20 range. That is the highest level in Dungeons & Dragons, the level where you take on archdevils and celestial beings. A typical party of adventurers would rarely ever reach such lofty heights, with many campaigns lasting to a manageable scale of around 10 to 12. That said, some of the enemies you would face on the same level in Final Fantasy were still consistent with what you could expect in a typical D&D campaign. Mind Flayers and Ogres were there, of course. The first major boss of Final Fantasy is the Lich, whom is situated somewhere around the level 20 range, the same as in D&D. But it was unheard of to just keep going from there. There are at least 3 more great evils for you to slay, and you've already destroyed what would be a classic final campaign boss in a tabletop RPG. There's a sense of deliberate choice in the selection of enemies and the escalation of numbers here, both crafted in a way that rewards players with prior RPG experience. I cannot imagine how that must have felt if you had only played tabletop D&D before, when you were used to a campaign only ever lasting up to level 12. Suddenly, you were here, somewhere in the level 30 to 40 range presumably, one slash of your sword dealing upwards of 100 damage, facing opponents whose health would scale into the thousands. You must have felt like a literal god back then, contending with the world-ending super threats. All thanks to a level of escalation that was only possible because we could finally shunt off 99% of the actual work to a machine. And this was still only the beginning, as subsequent entries in the franchise would take these numbers to even greater heights. Single digits grew into the thousands as early as Final Fantasy II, and would later break the long-established damage limit of 9,999 in Final Fantasy VIII. We feel that sense of power and growth. We feel the emotional impact of this simple escalation in numbers every time we play, but it can only escalate so much before you become numb to its effect. What is escalation alone without purpose? Today there's no shortage of games out there that help you live out your power fantasies by thrashing an ever-increasing number of enemies, dealing amounts of damage that are sometimes quite frankly meaningless. Historically, there have been games that demonstrated that a number can be more than just a way to get dopamine flowing through your brain folds. It can, for instance, wordlessly establish the power dynamic between 2 characters. There's no game that exemplifies this better than Breath of Fire 4. One of my favorite games of all times, honestly. A beautiful classical amalgamation of 2D pixel art and isometric 3D background models. Incredible game to this day, and it's not just because of how it looks and feels. It's also because it's a lesson in how to effectively employ the effect of numbers. In this game, you begin your journey in some remote desert location as this lost, conspicuously blue-haired young man named Ryu. Boy doesn't know where he is or where he's going and has no physical might to speak of save for the ability to wield a sword moderately well. And yeah, I get you, that's just typical JRPG fare. There's nothing special about the way you fight or the moves you have. It was all well established at that point. That is, until you advance a bit further into the story and the scene shifts and suddenly you find yourself playing the game from the perspective of someone else. Oh, look, I have no idea if I pronounced that right, let me know in the comments. The first emperor of the land awakened again after centuries of slumber, determined to set out and take back the kingdom that is rightfully his. The singular most powerful man in the world and the final boss of the game is now a character for you to control and experience, and that feeling is awesome. It puts you into the shoes of that which you'll one day become. Just one look at the menu tells you all you need to know. The immediate contrast between his stats and Ryu's make it clear that this man is just massively overpowered. He's like level 64 bro power nap for 1,000 years and didn't even get a stretch in yet, and he's already out here benching Ryu and Nina at the same time with one arm. You get to run around a bit and experience the Emperor's story and of course get into fights. The first thing you see is this scary ass massive dinosaur creature that looks like it could swallow you whole in one bite. You attack it once, and actually no, you don't attack once. You press the attack button that's supposed to attack once, but you attack twice instead, because that's just how much of a Chad you are now. Even the rules of the game have become meaningless in the face of your awesome power. Okay, actually you attack 3 times in total, but every single hit deals upwards of 2,000 damage, and you annihilate this massive 6,000 plus HP creature without breaking a sweat. And you don't even have a victory pose for that, bro just slow walks off the screen. This was the coolest thing I'd ever seen back then, and immediately established this guy as not only an absolute badass, but as a goal to attain, a level of power for you to reach. This is where Ryu must be one day. It's very rare to have an antagonist introduced so well and so thoroughly, and to craft an experience where a big number has an actual impact to boot. For this and much more, I will forever appreciate Breath of Fire 4. But it's not like Mr. Dragon Man is the only one with the license to give meaning to a number. There are ways to escalate to even the literal biggest conceivable number and still make it mean something. Let's jump a few years into the future together to the year 2010 and the advent of a series of games that is criminally still in the vice grip of evil cyberpunk corporation Nintendo. Xenoblade Chronicles is another JRPG that sets itself apart with an ambitious design philosophy for its time. Massive open world landscapes, day and night cycles, and a distinctly action-oriented battle system. We follow the story of Shulk, a young man living in a small colony who must become the new wielder of the legendary blade Monado as his hometown is besieged by mechanical invaders. Yada yada yada, innocent young boy becomes the chosen one and must save the world from impending doom, the classic JRPG sauce. As you are now fighting in a 3D environment in real time, there's a lot of numbers flying all over the place naturally, as there are also a lot more attacks happening at once than in classic turn-based systems. But that's not what makes it special. No, we have to jump a bit further ahead into the second half of the game to a point in the story after the transition from biological world to mechanical world. Here you are in the core of a giant robot fighting some idiot named Yaldabao. He doesn't matter, forget about him. I hardly remember anything about the plot of this game, it's been so long. Let's focus on the gameplay. One important mechanic specifically that's used to great effect in this particular fight. The Monado has the ability to give Shulk visions of the future that aid you in predicting dangerous enemy attacks that may completely demolish your party. This gives you the chance to intervene and change the otherwise inevitable outcome. Halfway through Bespoke boss fight, you'll see the vision of a future attack bestowed upon you by the Monado, but among all the brief glimpses into the future you've gotten thus far, this one is special. An impending, devastating move called Bionis/X that's about to deal an infinite amount of damage. Okay, Xenoblade, hold it right there. You know that's just excessive. We've even moved past comprehensible numbers now. That just doesn't make any sense. And I would agree, but you are not privy to the fact that actually this makes a lot of sense when you have all the relevant information. For you see, this is an attack performed by one giant mech and directed against another. Okay then, what's so special about that? I could see it if it was 10 or even 100,000, but infinity? How'd we end up here? Well, the thing is, these aren't just your regular old Gundams. Both of these mechs constitute the entire world of the game. Yes, these humanoid constructs are entire worlds with multiple ecosystems, settlements, and people living on them. And the one being targeted in that scene embodies the very world you have traversed to get here. It's all the landmarks you have seen and all the people you have ever known. This isn't just one giant robot against another, this is a strike to end an entire world. What you would categorize as an anti-world Noble Phantasm and the Fate franchise. That is the kind of threat that's expressed in the infinity symbol. It's an attack on an incomprehensible scale. Like, you are a normal human and you're already hitting damage in the thousands. Imagine what the literal planet Earth could do. What the number, or lack thereof, signifies is simply the fact that whatever damage is being done here is impossible for the human mind to comprehend. It's giving meaning to a non-number that would otherwise be entirely excessive and meaningless. Xenoblade managed to escalate to the absolute limit and still embed that escalation in a reasonable framework, and for that, it deserves some credit. And I would say that's it, that the art of big numbers has been lost and there's no modern game that understands how to tie a number into any kind of meaningful narrative. That we've ended up with nothing but dopamine slop created for the sole purpose of making our brains feel good as we mindlessly mash buttons. Except that I can't actually say that. You may have forgotten, you may have lost sight of the great classic heroes of video game mythology. Leave it to Final Fantasy once again to swoop in with the 16th entry in its series to show us that it hasn't yet forgotten how to make damage meaningful. Here's the story of Clive, a young prince on a quest for revenge on the beast that has taken the life of his brother. Shunned and betrayed by his own mother, Clive is enslaved by the enemy, whom invaded his homeland, and must now serve as their frontline soldier. Yes, the game has problems. Yes, the reception has been mixed. Yes, it's somewhat lacking in substance. Yes, John, shut up. I know. I hear you, John. I know, just give me a moment. I have a point. So the game didn't quite deliver on expectations for a lot of people, and it's likely the most polarizing entry in the entire series. Even more so than 13, for which we can at least all agree that it sucks and belongs in the bin with all the other subpar Final Fantasies. Yet, despite all the mixed reviews, Final Fantasy XVI still has an edge over other entries in the series in one aspect and one aspect only: hype moments and aura, which the to-date newest entry in the franchise perhaps achieves by forgoing traditional turn-based combat for a more hack-and-slash-like approach heavily inspired by the Devil May Cry series. Maybe that's because they hired the guy who designed combat for Devil May Cry to overhaul the entire system. Despite this departure from traditional turn-based combat, you'll still see old familiar numbers-based character growth and progression systems. I don't think I need to tell you that there's numbers in the game. I don't think I need to let you know that they reach into the thousands either. That's old news, we've seen that in every Final Fantasy so far, so what new revelation could this one possibly hold? You see, there are essentially two different scales to the battles in Final Fantasy XVI. Human scale battles, where you control Clive, and the much more bombastic Icon scale battles, where you play as Ifrit. When you play as Clive, the damage you deal reflects the scale you're used to. Hundreds into thousands, that's the typical Final Fantasy power scale. Most games in the franchise operate on this level. But when you turn into Ifrit, your first attack makes it abundantly clear that you're moving on a different scale entirely. One single swipe of your claw deals upwards of 30,000 damage immediately. That localized escalation is important to appropriately convey the threat level of the massive kaijus duking it out on screen. It wouldn't feel right if it was any less than that. Knowing the sheer size of these beasts, we know instinctively that they must naturally deal way more damage and be significantly more durable than any regular human being. Especially since they're casually throwing sometimes borderline world-ending attacks at each other. Shut up, I don't want to hear another word about Donald F. Duck in the comments. It's not the same Zeta Flare. Stop typing, John! Final Fantasy XVI has some problems, like why does the last difficulty mode unlock only when you beat the game? Whose idea was that? But it certainly has some of the most hype and memorable moments in the entire franchise, and I think for that the game deserves some credit. Oh, and also Clive punches the final boss in the face for 999,999 damage, and that's cool, that's hype, I like that. I'm gonna use that as a thumbnail. So you see, it's not just about making the numbers on screen go bigger or using them as a tool to express character growth. There are ways to use something so mundane to viscerally express dynamics that would otherwise not be immediately apparent. Fortunately, the subtlety of this design philosophy is still not entirely lost on us, and maybe in the future we can look forward to more games that make damage mean something again. And if you know of any other games that utilize numbers in smart ways that reach beyond just big damage go brrr, then leave a comment down below. Anyway, that's all from me. See you later.